So the subtitle of tonight's talk is The Good Stuff. I'm going to share some of my favorite highlights from the book. And I'll set the stage for it. This is the perspective that I have on writing the book, is that you are responsible for your career, right? You are the CEO of your career. And in your career, you're going to have at least one job. And many of us have more than one job, right? And jobs are important, but the career is something that lasts longer than a single job, and that's something that you have to be very intentional about. And has anybody read any books by Cal Newport, The Deep Work Author? Yeah. One of his earlier books was called So Good They Can't Ignore You, which to me is just an excellent book. It talks about lifestyle-centric career planning. But it says that when you're choosing your career, you're looking for qualities in the jobs and in your career, where you get to live, what you get paid, what kind of skills you get to do, who you get to work with. And to get really good things from your career, you need to have something to trade in return. And the phrase he uses is rare and valuable skills. You need to have skills that make money for a commercial company or provide value for a nonprofit or a government agency, right? And so it's an important goal of us as professionals is continuing to develop those rare and valuable skills. And so that's the background in the book that I wrote. It's a skill-based book. It's called Hands-on APIs for AI and Data Science. And the idea of the book is that as you go through the 3 sections, there's a section on building APIs with data scientists in mind, a section on using APIs in traditional data science, analytics, ETL, and methods like that. And then a section on using them with AI, so building out or deploying machine learning models using it with generative AI. And so each of these chapters that has individual projects in it are individual components that you do the coding with. So you build through into 3 portfolio projects, and the code repos are available whether you get the book or not. But as you build out these project-centric tasks, you build these building block skills. And that's something that you then have to build your career with. And that's kind of how the book is written. It just came out from O'Reilly Publishing. It's a #1 new release, been doing very well. And so I'm really excited about kind of sharing some information. Here's some of the rare and valuable skills that a data scientist will get out of it. This is a sampling of it, and I'll share a couple of these tonight. You'll learn how to create Python APIs with FastAPI, SQL Alchemy, and Pydantic. Pydantic is one of them they mentioned. That's another event coming up. You'll learn how to deploy APIs to multiple cloud hosts, how to create Python SDKs, publish an SDK to PyPy, and to create generative AI applications using LangChain and ChatGPT. So that's an example of kind of the skills. Each of those is something that, you're not building a massive production-ready application, right? But you're building out the scaffolding and getting hands-on about how to do those things. And then you start to kind of bolt those skills together to where you really have great value that you can provide. So I want to share some thanks on this one. First, thanks to Prima, Jeff, all the organizers of Data Science DC. Whenever I got to speak a couple times to different groups from Data Community DC while I was developing the book. And some of you attended some of those, and I was able to get some really great feedback on what I was writing in the book, really workshop that content. So if you look in the preface of the book, one of the thanks I give is to Data Science DC, Data Community DC for helping on that. So really appreciate your contribution. Also, Lachey Dove, Kamika Moore, Wendy Rollin, are any of you in here? Raise your hands. Those are folks from CSBS, my company, who helped organize the food in the event tonight. So let's give them a round of applause. My company was generous enough to cater all that, so I'm really grateful. The other thing that I mentioned in the book is Chris Rowley, Nakvu, and the staff at CSBS, who were excited for me and encouraged me to write the book. So I think Chris is here. Raise your hand. That's my boss. So CSBS, we're a nonprofit member organization for state financial regulators, play a really important part in the regulation of financial institutions. It's a wonderful mission, really great organization to work for. It's in the building here. and they were just super supportive of me getting to do this. So I would like to say that really, writing the book is a culmination of many years of really dedicated hard work. But my editors at O'Reilly don't let me use words like culmination and stuff like that. They whipped all that out of me. I have to speak a little more plainly. So I'll keep it really simple. This is what it looks like to write a book. Okay, so I signed the contract in October of 2023. I broke my hand in March of 2024, which it turns out, like having 6 months or 2 months, 6 weeks or 2 months without being able to type is kind of difficult for a writing schedule. But O'Reilly was very patient on that.
You typing too fast, or what was the issue?
Yeah, I was playing basketball actually was what broke the hand. Delivered the last chapter in November of 2024, and then it was just printed in March. So that's kind of been the journey. Just for some analytics here for you. So it's 352 pages, 88,000 words, 40 Python files, and 2,922 lines of code. And what I'm sharing tonight, I've got a GitHub repo of the demos that reuse a lot of the code from the book. I'll be sharing that repo, but whether you buy the book or not, as I mentioned, all the code's out there available. I'd love for you to learn something from that. Here's just a few of the kind things that some people I respect a lot said about it. Becoming a Data Head is a fantastic book if you haven't read it, and the author of that, Alex, gave a review of the book. Eric Eager, the vice president of the football analytics at Carolina Panthers, had a really nice review there, and Catherine Nelson, who I got introduced to through speaking at the Full Stack Data Scientist DC, who's written one of the books I gave away tonight, Software Engineering for Data Scientists. Highly recommend as well. So here's top 5 tools that I used in the book. Used probably about twice this many, but FastAPI is, if you're seeing APIs built in the generative AI or AI space, they're probably using FastAPI. It's a Python, equivalent to like a Flask or a Django, except it's focused on APIs only. It's really built around asynchronous programming and the StreamLit framework. And it's a great skill to learn for data scientists around APIs. Pydantic, we mentioned, is used all throughout the code in this one. GitHub Code Spaces, if you've not used GitHub Code Spaces, use it. Getting the book is a great way to learn that tool, but it's a wonderful development environment for Python. All of the dependency hell and things like that you have to worry about and deal with kind of takes care of that. You just pull down the code and run it in GitHub Code Spaces. StreamLit is a really very simple, great Python for framework for data apps. And then the generative AI APIs I used for this are actually Anthropic, which were very easy to work with. So those are some of those rare and valuable skills that would be great for you to learn there. So here is the code repo if you want to take a picture. It's under my Ryan Day Dev GitHub. It's called Good Stuff DC. So I went too fast there, didn't I? Prima, I'm going to take an extra 5 minutes. Yeah, so that's the repo of this one. So I'm going to show you real quickly. These are some skills. I hope you'll get enough tonight to get a flavor of a mental framework for a few different ways that APIs are used in AI and data science. And then really encourage you to take the repo that I've shared tonight, go create a GitHub code space with it, and just run this code and walk through it. So the first is to create a Python SDK. So I had not built my own Python SDK for an API before I wrote the book, but if you interact with any of the generative AI APIs, like OpenAI, Anthropic, all of these, typically the way you'll do it is by a pip install, right? As a data scientist, if you're doing it in Python, you'll download their software development kit either through pip or maybe off of their website. And it is a wrapper that completely wraps an API. And in addition to handling things like what's the URL and how do I do the authentication and stuff like that, it imposes good coding practices on it. So for them as an API provider, they know that if you're using their SDK, you're going to use it in a high performance, less error prone way. And so you can see there the SDK here next to the user. So in order to do that, typically you would build the code and package it in Python, deploy it on PyPy. I had a lot of fun doing the research on this one, looking at the Bono 3 Python SDK from AWS is kind of the standard that everybody compares to, right? As well as several other good SDKs that I used and researched and interviewed in the book, some of their developers for it. There's a lot of interesting decisions you make about how you package it and things like that. But the end result, that all of the code that required ended up with 2 Python files, a config object in which a user creates it and puts some of the configuration information, and then a client file which they call the API. And in this case, a set of Pydantic schemas for that. And so with those files, I made a few of those decisions that I made it there. I mentioned about use setup tools as one of the packaging tools. Some other information there about how I tested it. So let me show you real quick what that looks like. I'll show you the GitHub code space here. So you can see GitHub code space is an environment that has VS Code running in a container, as well as a Linux instance running here. Oh, I'm sorry. It looks great on my screen here. Let me drag this over. That's a lot better. Okay. So with that, the SDK, so I mentioned a couple of files, a couple of Python files that you create, as well as the PyProject is how you package it so that you can publish it to PyPy. I'd highly encourage you, if you've never published your own package to PyPy, you really should. One interesting thing you learn is that anybody can publish something to PyPy. And once you've published your own without the police calling or getting a background check, you realize, I guess I need to be really careful about what I download from PyPy. But with that, I'll use the SDK a little bit later and show how that's done. Let me see, I probably got a Jupyter notebook here. So with that, basically to use the SDK I created, I won't run the API, but typically I can have the API, the code is here to run it in your notebook. You import those libraries after you've done pip install. You create a config object with your URL, and then you do list leagues. You just pull your data, and then you start taking that data and putting it into polars or Python, things like that. So it's a really powerful lesson for API providers to learn to see a data scientist use an SDK and like, wow, that's really easy, right? We should do that. And that's kind of the lesson with that one. All right, next one here is, and so there's a full chapter in the book where you can build all of that yourself. Next one is to create an AI agent with LangGraph and the Anthropic APIs. This is a little more complicated. The SDK that we built is still used in this architecture, and we've got the API, the same API, in this case is running in your GitHub code space. Gonna call it through a Jupyter notebook, but the thing that you learn here is, in order to create an agent, the agent in this case is going to decide when to call your API. It's going to answer questions that you ask it through the chat. Then it's going to look at the tools that you provided, in this case my API, and then it's going to, I've got 5 minutes, I promise. Then it's going to use that tool to call it. And so just a couple of tools, code files are required in this case. The Jupyter notebook, in which you'll instantiate the SDK from Anthropic, build the LangGraph code and build your object for calling the API. And then a toolkit, which is where you define your API's wrapper so that the generative AI application can use your API. And so I'll show you that one here. So in the AI agent and the notebook there, so a lot of this work up front is creating the LangGraph library. LangGraph is a library for creating agents. It's related to LangChain. Then we import a toolkit that we created as a wrapper to the SDK. And this is basically if you're talking to generative AI and say, what can I do with that API of yours? This toolkit is a construct that you use to inform the generative AI model about it. So then, basically I would instantiate this toolkit that I created. Then I set up the model. This is, you're calling the Anthropic API, get there set up. Then you chat, basically. So I say, what are the leagues in the sports world central fantasy football? And so if you did this without the toolkit, it would say, like, I don't have any idea, I wasn't trained on that, right? But you're providing this toolkit which has information in it. With that, it looks at the toolkit and says, oh, I'll call the get leagues endpoint off of your toolkit. And then it says, based on the information retrieved, here's a list of the leagues. So simple use case there, but basically it teaches you the whole plumbing process of instantiating an agent, providing resources to it. So if you think about one of the very trending topics right now is the Model Context Protocol, right, MCP. So MCP would be used in this situation as another layer of a standardized interface that all the different models would use. So you would, I do have an example where I took this same SDK and instead of creating a LangChain tool wrapper, I created an MCP server to do the same thing. But really worthwhile to kind of put these pieces together and understand all the parts that a model is doing. Last one we'll do before we have our fireside chat here is deploying a machine learning model with ONNX runtime. And so when I went to create the chapter about using FastAPI to deploy a machine learning model, one of the things that had just come out is that on the Hugging Face portal, a lot of the pickle file models had security vulnerabilities in them. So a lot of times the pickle format is what we use to take a model, store it, and then reuse it, right? Pickle has vulnerabilities that when someone unloads a pickle model, it can include commands to run commands in your local Python environment. And so I kind of freaked out, like, okay, I'm not going to write a book with that vulnerability. What do I do? And so the ONNX runtime is a platform-independent runtime for taking models. In this case, I use scikit-learn. You compile it into the ONNX format, and then built an API where it uses the ONNX runtime to perform inference. So the API is basically wrapping the ONNX runtime to make the call. So here's that ONNX runtime I mentioned. So for this one, I have my API file here, the FastAPI code. I have pydantic schemas to control the input and output and do the validation. I've got the three, in this case I had three separate scikit-learn models so I could return a 10, 50%, and 90% answer on the prediction that I do. And then with that, you have a FastAPI model. If you've used FastAPI, it generates the interactive documentation. And so you see here, it would have the endpoint of the predict, basically, so they pass in information. I think I've got the code on that one. So then if you look at the code to make this work, that's the NO model. So again, you've got a FastAPI that does all of the API work and generates that documentation, the OpenAPI spec. You've got the three models which are compiled into the ONNX runtime format. And then when the user calls the predict endpoint, it interacts with the ONNX runtime then to execute that. It's very fast and it's platform independent, so you could use ONNX runtime as a standard for, you create this in Java, you model in Java, you create all these different libraries, put it into ONNX runtime format. So those are three rare and valuable skills that are worth learning. Check out the GitHub repo there. And with that, I think we're going to chat a little bit. Test, 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 test. It works. So while we get set up, so we'll do this for about 15 minutes here, and then we got the table set up if you'd like to buy a book tonight. It's cheaper than Amazon, and I'd love to sign that for you, and get a photo of you, and share that. Even if you don't want to get one tonight, I'd love to get a photo with you and share that on LinkedIn. If you could share that you heard about this great book, that really makes a difference on people getting the word out with it. And I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn too if we're not connected. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Prima.
Okay, so to start with, before we kind of get into like the book kind of specific questions, does anybody have questions about the talk?
Any questions on the content there?
So for the stuff that you talk about in the book, about data and API, do you assume that we are in a cloud environment or in an on-premise service, or is ignorant of that, indifferent to that?
Yeah, all the deployment options that I show it deploying in the GitHub code space environment, which would be kind of the equivalent of either in your own cloud or in an on-prem. I've definitely heard of people who do deploy their models, for instance, internally using FastAPI. But then I also show the deployment instructions to render, which is kind of a simple cloud-based deployment, as well as using AWS. Yeah, so I'd say you get a little flavor of both there with it.
Thank you.
The book's talking about LangChain, LangGraph, but API changes so frequently, so I guess how do you kind of address that? Every time I go to LangGraph, it's a completely different, user interface.
I know. Yeah. Try writing a book where it's changing that fast, right? Yeah. So LangGraph was pretty new when I wrote that, but it is the reason I chose it. LangChain was really early, right? And they have a very broad adoption. It's just a high-level framework for building agents with the different. They're compatible with Anthropic, OpenAI, all the different ones, right? LangGraph is their future direction of that one, so it's the new framework that they've built for building, multi-agent frameworks and stuff like that. So I think that it's one that's going to continue to grow. Also, the code's still building. The way I set up the code repos, it has non-breaking changes. It's continuing to work, and so in generative AI, who knows, right? A year from now, whether the code will work, but then we'll just get to do a version 2 of the book at that point. Yeah.
So version 2 of the book is actually a great way to get to my question, which is, if you'd had 3 more months, what would you have added to the book?
So the time wasn't the problem, it was the space in the book with that one. I think 3 months, if I wrote it now, I would try to put model context protocol in it, because I think that's one that it was only, model context protocol was created, announced like October, November by Anthropic, but once OpenAI said they were going to adopt it as a standard, I think it's one that is, it's going to stick. Now I will say they haven't put any security on it yet, so by the time version 2 of book comes around, hopefully it's got security and authentication and things, we can include it too.
So that actually leads me to a question I have. This is just in relation to FastAPI, Pydantic, and developing AI-based APIs. How do you ensure security? Do you cover that in your book? Are there any resources or places that most of us should be aware about or aware of?
So I don't address security of the API. So the APIs I show don't even have authentication on them, stuff like that. But O'Reilly has several good FastAPI books that are based on running in production. Yes, I think that's where I look at the books, it's running in production or the hard parts, things like that, right, where they go into the more the advanced use cases. That one, yeah. Pydantic is not as much an issue for security. It's a validation framework, very mature. But yeah, to build a production FastAPI, at a minimum, you would want to put an API gateway in front of it, right? Or you could go ahead and use the FastAPI authentication itself. Yeah. Okay, so hold those questions. I think we're going to go into the next section here.
Okay. So our first kind of topic is benefit to readers. So what are some key ideas that you hope readers take from your book?
So one is you should be building. Like that's the concept of the book is learning is fine, reading content and stuff like that, or asking ChatGPT or looking at topics, blog posts are fine, but you learn differently when you're building. Task-based learning, when you say, okay, I want to go accomplish this goal, how might I accomplish that? Then you go out and seek out the tools to do it and start building toward a goal. You just learn very differently than you do in a situation where you're just reading the content. So that would be the first one, is that you should be doing that one. The other is, I really believe from a career perspective, portfolio projects are extremely valuable. And so I think that, if you say you're a data analyst or to become a data scientist, or you're a data scientist who wants to become a senior, things like that, you're limited what you can do in the day job, right? Like we work in, with very secure data, things like that, with a lot of constraints around what we can do in the day job. But when you're building in a GitHub code space with a goal that you've created, you can try out everything, right? And you can explore everything like that. And so then you can build that into a professional-looking portfolio on GitHub. Then when you talk to a recruiter, or you talk to your internal recruiter, a boss who says, like, I would like to have some new opportunities, and they know what you've done in the day job, but if you can say, here's what I've built, right? So those would be a couple of things.
Kind of related question, what are some tangible skills that readers will get from your book?
Yeah, so I mentioned the list of those from a data science perspective. If you flip your hat over and you're an API product manager, an API developer who doesn't know anything about us data scientists, there's chapters in there that explain, like, what are the features that become valuable to data scientists? How can you add features there that are beneficial? And just in general, the concept of the book is that APIs are an interface, right? And so typically you're on one side or the other. You're either a consumer of one or you're a producer. A great way to learn is to flip roles and walk in the other person's shoes. And so for people who are API producers, software developers, we show them how to consume your API in Python and a Jupyter Notebook, and pretty soon you're like, oh, like a pip install would be kind of nice, right? And if you're a data scientist who's always consuming it, and you wonder why the stupid API designer is always doing that, well, if you have to build your own, you'll realize the constraints of the builders, right? So that's another concept there.
What are the job titles of for your ideal audience?
Yeah, so I think really targeted early career data scientist, data engineer, data analyst who wants to move into data analytics on that side, and then software developers, API product managers who have heard about this AI thing, they've heard about data scientists, how do I address that market? So that's the other side there. It's kind of like the big Venn diagram, the book's kind of right in the middle between those two areas.
What's your favorite book besides Hands-on APIs for AI and data science?
Oh, there's been so many good ones. I love the Phoenix Project because I love the novelization. There was a really great Headfirst book years ago, Headfirst Java server pages and something when I was doing a Java certification. And it was, Headfirst those are very hands-on books. And it's the first one I did where I really felt like I got architecture. They walked you through and explained the architecture of the front controller pattern and all these things, and it's just like my mind, I felt like it had grown 20 spaces. And I mentioned becoming a data head. If you have a business executive who wants to understand, machine learning, statistics, data, that's a great book to really give you a mental model of a lot of things in machine learning and data science.
Great. I would give back to the audience to ask kind of questions on this topic or anything else.
So I had a question on taking what you're showing at the book and I haven't read it, right? And how do you
They're on
test
sale
it?
afterward.
Why? how do you test it, right? So be it on latency, be it on volume, how do you basically stress test it, and any tips or recommendations there?
Yeah, there's a chapter in there which is what do data scientists need to know about APIs, and it gives you a really broad range of things, and one of those is the different types of testing. So it talks about 5 or 6 different functional testing and load testing, and it has some examples in there about some tool like Java. I try to keep everything Python open source, so some Python open source tools for load testing in there, yeah. And security is really important too.
I'd be curious to hear what is the worst API that you've gotten to use, and what you hope the author of that would learn from your book.
Yeah, I won't throw anybody particularly under the bus, but one thing I did focus on was that, as data scientists, I'm a big believer in including standardized identifiers and codes and things like that. I've definitely had some APIs where all of their identifiers were all their internal keys, and it was just like, if I worked at your company, I guess that would all make sense. But what they would learn is to look at what are the industry standard identifiers, and whether it's retail or, my example uses sports, so there's an NFL standard NFL player ID that comes from the NFL play-by-play thing. Just go to the extra effort to include that in your data set, even if you don't need it internally, so that you can share it out. And so when we need to join to 3 different data sources to build our Jupyter notebook, that we've got standard identifiers to use.
Okay. Next topic, books in general and the writing process. What do you think makes technical books a good format for learning?
The thing I really love about a nice fat book, one is that you can go directly to the part of the book that you want. And so each of these chapters, has code that you can start. There's a lot of things in the book that said start from here. Like you can just go to the repo, chapter 4, and I just want to focus on this one part. In a video or live training or stuff, a lot of times, sometimes you have to really wade through the stuff you're not interested to get to it. The other thing too about a book is that if the learner has the time, you can follow through one project all the way through. So in this case, all the process in part 1 about building out this API, and then thinking about what are the use cases that would be used for in Jupyter Notebooks or an ETL pipeline on that. And then what if I wanted to use it in a ChatGPT custom agent or that? And so I like the ability to really have a through line to really connect the business side of all the technology.
Why did you want to write a data science book?
Yeah, so for me, always wanted to write a book, right? And sometimes you're always sort of on the lookout for when you think I know enough about that topic that people could learn from it. And a couple years ago when generative AI, the ChatGPT moment, right? All over LinkedIn, a lot of tutorials and blog posts were being written. People are doing a lot of trainings to introduce you to RAG agents or all these things. And everything was in Python. Everything was using FastAPI and all the examples. And I had worked on FastAPI as an open source contributor, and was experienced in Python. And it's kind of like it was that Python API data science moment where it all came together. And so I felt like, hey, if I'm not going to write this book, I need to just quit worrying about it and do it. So I made the pitch to O'Reilly and signed the contract.
That's great. I think this is very timely, the topics in your book.
Thanks.
What was most rewarding about writing the book?
The coolest thing has been the opportunities, to speak to meetups. Got invited to a lot of conferences, and have met a lot of. I interviewed Samuel Colvin, the guy that created Pydantic, in a section of the book. Just so many opportunities for people when they know that you're writing a book. They're really interested in helping you out and helping you do that. And so I was really pretty nervous about. You put yourself out there about criticism or imposter syndrome, all those things, right? And honestly, there's been very few negative things. Everything has been so encouraging. I got my first 1-star review on Amazon, and it was, they said, they bought the book, and the outside of the book had my book's cover. The inside was like a down-home cooking recipe book, and they gave me a 1-star review for that. So, I don't know. Hopefully they returned it and got the real book. I don't know about that. That's been the only negative so far.
It was not on the content itself.
Yeah, well, the content. So.
What was most challenging about writing the book?
The generative AI stuff is just moving so fast. Literally the chapters, LangGraph and custom GPTs, neither of those things existed when I signed the contract. And so it's very challenging to in one chapter be able to not only be able to explain the code so that someone can learn it, but get it to run in a working environment in GitHub code spaces so they can just do pip install requirements and it'll run the first time. And as far as I know, every chapter does that. And so that was tough, but very rewarding when, I mean, I go to my repo sometimes, I'll just create a new code space and like pip install and runs, like, ah, still runs. That's pretty nice.
All right, so we'll kind of do some wrap-up questions. So your book uses the business of fantasy football for its example, and you once wrote a blog post titled, "Learn Anything Using Fantasy Football." So what's the story behind that?
Yeah, so is anybody fantasy football managers or anybody like those? Yeah, fantasy football it's full of stats and it's a lot of fun. You games, you compete and stuff like that on it. And whenever I decided I was going to write the book, I knew it was going to be a lot of work, and I thought, well, if I do it about something that's fun for me, it'll probably make it a little easier. So I'd say the lesson takeaway with that one is, like, when you're doing these projects and build them, find a really interesting business domain that you really understand and you're interested in, because, you know, in data science, like when you do the toy data examples, Titanic or whatever, and it always just works, and you're like, oh, I guess creating machine learning models is pretty easy, right? But when you have a business domain that you really know in and out, then you have that sniff test, right? When you're like, oh, here's the predictive thing, and you're looking at that and you're like, I do not trust any of those data features they've chosen, right? And so that's the takeaway I'd say, is like really choose a business domain where the data is interesting to you, and you'll spend more time with it, I think.
How did you determine that there was probably a market for this book?
Yeah, that as I mentioned, like when LinkedIn, like everything you read on LinkedIn is kind of, I think I could write the book. That was a good sign, you know. But then the publishing process with O'Reilly, you write a proposal and they're very regimented. You have to convince them that there's enough people who want to buy the topic, that you're qualified to write it. So they kind of walk through that process, and by the time you went through that, when they signed me, it's like, okay, I think if they're willing to invest the money in it, I think that they think there's going to be readers there. And that's been the case so far, so it's been good.
What do data scientists most misunderstand about working with APIs?
So the typical data science examples, you know, everybody like import requests, and then you put the URL there, and you just do a get on it. And so it's a toy example, right? And so I think the nice thing about, I love APIs. I've been a huge REST API fan for years. The great thing about them is they're so quick to get up and running. If you do a get, you can do it in a browser, right? You can immediately understand it. But if you're building an interface that has to run day after day, you need to be thinking about authentication, error handling, back off. There's a lot of these additional skills. And so I think that's why Python SDKs are so great. They're doing a ton of stuff that you don't know about. And there's like a lot more, I don't want to say it's complex, but there's a lot more resiliency that you can build in, so that if it's in your ETL pipeline and it has to run at midnight, you're not going to get paged, you know? Do we have time for maybe a couple more from the crowd here before I think it's about time to wrap up? Any questions about the book writing or anything?
Do you have anything in the book on like gRPC, API design, or private API design?
There is a discussion of different architectural styles of it. So I talk about comparing GraphQL and REST APIs and gRPC, and then I focus in on the REST one. But there are, I think there are some references that I may link out to on the gRPC. When you look at the usage, kind of when I went in, I was curious. I use REST a lot, but maybe it was just me, right? When you look at the surveys, you know, from Anaconda or different things like that, REST is still by far and away the most used architectural style, even though you hear a lot about gRPC and GraphQL and stuff like that. Yeah.
What was your least favorite part about writing the book?
I think just the grind, you know, it's like you've got a chapter due and you want to go to bed and you're still doing that. It takes so much endurance to keep hitting those deadlines, and you get the email from your development editor like, hey, we're thinking maybe you could have this done like another month earlier. What do you think? You know? Oh my. Yes.
Assuming that someone ordered a cookbook and receive your book instead, what would your pitch be to them to actually learn your book instead of leaving a 1-star review on it?
I mean, you've got to be able to like return books, right? I think like if you returned and got your money back, do you really have to do the review? So I would say just remember that the author is a nice person on the other end and is really sorry about your purchasing experience.
So what's the content pros for FastAPI?
Yeah, so FastAPI, it's fast in 2 ways, okay? And so it's dead simple to get started. You know, just 10 lines of code. You can create a REST API, that, like a Hello World REST API, that has full interactive documentation, as we showed, generates an open API specification. And so the developer experience is fantastic. Even while halfway through the book, they added a CLI that improved, you know, now you can just do FastAPI run. They also just this week launched a major new company called FastAPI Cloud, where they're going to be able to like have cloud deployment for it. It's got venture capital backing now, and so really exciting there. Then on the speed, if you're generating APIs with Python, which many people are doing in the data science, FastAPI is just about the fastest possible way to do that with Python, faster than a Flask or a Django or that one. It's built on StreamLit, which has asynchronous programming, which is a fairly new feature of Python. And so it's similar in speed to some of the other platforms like a Node.js and some things like that. Yeah, so that's a couple of the pitches for it. It is not I don't make any money off people using FastAPI. The other thing too is in generative AI space, everything, I mean 99% of the demos that you see of building an API, it's FastAPI. It's a great framework just for wide usage. Yes, sir.
I don't think I saw anything about StreamLit. Just in a nutshell, could you give me the pitch for it? Why should I be using it? What is it?
Yeah, so StreamLit is building data apps, right? And so as opposed to Tableau, full dashboard, and things like that, sometimes you've got a machine learning model and it's like, this is really great sitting on my Linux terminal, now what? And StreamLit is Python native. It allows you to embed a lot of like Plotly and different visualizations with just Python code. Kind of like FastAPI, StreamLit, you know, like a dozen lines of code, you have a working data web app, pretty nice user interface. So it's, to me, if I were, you know, I had like a business user inside my company and they're like, hey, how can I use that machine learning model? StreamLit's a great way to do it. You pip install StreamLit, then you create a working web app and then throw it up on an internal server and do that. You can publish them in the cloud as well, yeah. So it's similar to Gradio. Plotly Dash is some other Python native data app frameworks. I think we probably have time for one more and then we'll break. Feel free to hang out and visit, and we'll be selling and signing books back there at the back. I'd love to chat with you some more.
Yeah, are there any like developer tools that you really like for larger code bases? Like you mentioned Pydantic or like Pydantic as well. Do you ever try using MyPy for static type thinking and some other types of developer tooling, like poetry instead of pip or something?
The one that I want to check out is UV, you know, and so I built everything out using pip install and using requirements files and all that, the PyProject, that one. But it sounds like for managing a virtual environments and for doing your dependencies, it has some advantages of installing stuff in an offline mode, I think, so you don't download the stuff. So I would say check out UV. That's the one that's going to be in version 2 of the book. I imagine 2 as well. I haven't had a chance to go back and learn that, but I hear a lot of good things about that. I think we'll call it here. Thanks so much for everybody's time.